Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanik. I am teaching comparative Indian language and literature at the University of Calcutta. Today we will discuss Introduction to Translation Studies, and our focus is on module concept of translation in Western and Indian traditions. Translation is, in broader sense, is as old and as common as the human expression in the human civilization. At the age of silence, when human being was not able to communicate with words, but they used to communicate with different gestures, acting, dancing, human being used to translate their mind into different kind of performances. Later on, when the man found words and sound in as their skill, they also started to communicate with the greater community with the process of translation. The story of Babel of the Bible shows how the God brings divisions in the communities of the man, and because of that, the translation appeared as unavoidable medium of communicating. Each civilization holds its own method, practice and culture of translation. Translation is an ever-continuing force in any civilization. Each civilization shows its own pattern of translation, reception of translation and objective of translation. Translation in a community is emerged not only to communicate with the outsiders of the community, but also to communicate with the insiders. Translation as a medium holds records of knowledge of a particular community. Oral tradition is quite often recorded into manuscripts when a community discovered themselves to be written. If a community is solely dependent on the oral tradition, that community also tries to keep their knowledge alive through different modes of translations, through different artistic mediums. In this process of carrying knowledge of a particular community, translation is observed in the method of changing signs and medium. Translation's role as communication is one of the oldest practices in the domain of translation. Ancient travelers used to communicate through different modes of translation. Ancient and medieval civilization of India and Arab found translation as a mode of transferring knowledge from one civilization to another. Indian ancient text Panchatantra was received by Persians and it was translated into Persian, and from that Europe came to know about this ancient Indian text. The cultural connections between Arab world and India also has a friendly exchange of literature through translation. Not only the unavoidable or natural mode of communicative translation, but also the literary translation has its age-old history among the civilizations. India and the West both has very old tradition of literary translation, and these two civilizations came to encounter with each other since the very beginning of European colonialism in India. Both the civilizations came to know about each other's patterns of translating during the time of colonization. It is needless to mention that these two civilizations observes very distinct culture of receiving translation, very distinct method of doing translation, and very distinct way of commenting on translation. The basic difference between the notions of translation into these two civilizations is in Indian translation is received in its multiplicity, whereas in West or in Europe translation is received in very particular mode of literary communication, which will be explored later in this module. But it is also has to be observed that the scientific study of translation is not begun in India but in West. Scientific study of Indian translation is something which is yet to get adequate attention. Colonial experiences and post-colonial studies insisted for the scientific study of Indian translation, as translation carries history of culture and civilization, and translation also used as a tool of colonial domination in India. translation as an area of study is very much significant in India because of colonial rule and colonizers' use of translation for different purposes. But still, Indian scholarship is much ignorant towards defining translation. Though the definitions of translation already are there in different Indian ancient and medieval texts. To find the notion of translation, a community already is having is to find the history of translation itself and history of the community, where different thoughts, ideas and cultural communication or cross connection happens in language. As this module does not deal with history of translation or not deals with translation in history, we briefly will discuss different definitions and notions of translation found in Western and Indian culture in different texts, times and on the notes of the thinkers. Here we also will discuss on the definition which is introduced by different translation theorists. Let us talk very few words about the introduction of translation studies as a discipline. Translation studies as a discipline deals with translation as a method, as a production and as a phenomena. To understand the definition or notion of translation, I believe it is important to understand first the discipline, because the discipline offers scientific study of translation, and scholars and theorists engaged with the discipline shape the definition of translation which is found in particular culture and history of language and community. It is not the case that the proper definition of translation is found only when the discipline is emerged, but the discipline helps to assimilate, organize and historically placed the definitions of the translation. It is only the discipline which popularize few definitions of translation according to the requirement. I would specifically consider the discipline's interference in the discourse of translation, as it finds the definitions and notions on translation from the dark alleys of the history and culture. Emergence of discipline of translation studies in the West is also historically significant in India, because this information insists Indian academics to introduce it, and since the time Indian scholars started to practice translation studies as a paper in literature department or introduced it as an independent discipline, gradually the study of translation increased and Indian scholars started to look into history to find the notions of translation already is there in Indian culture. Translation studies as a discipline deals with varieties of issues related with translation. Jeremy Mundy, in his book Introducing Translation Studies, Theories and Applications, defines the nature of the discipline as, I quote, translation studies is the new academic discipline related to the study of the theory and phenomena of translation. By its nature, it is multilingual and also interdisciplinary, encompassing languages, linguistics, communication studies, philosophy, and a range of types of cultural studies. I unquote. The key term translation studies is popularized by the Dutch-based US scholar James S. Holmes in his paper published in 1972. Holmes wrote translation studies is concerned with, I quote, the complex of problems clustered around the phenomena of translating and translations, unquote. Translation studies as a discipline since 1990s has been expanding its scope. It includes the study of not only literary translation but also offers training to the translators, deals with adaptation, filmic translation, legal translation, translation of non-literary documents, studying history and translation, sociology and translation, aesthetics and translation, gender and translation, globalization and translation, comparative literature and translation, and cultural studies and translation, etc. Now, let us talk about the idea of translation which emerged from the Western languages or emerged by the Western scholars. Before beginning this discussion, I would like to quote Eugene Nida about the whole issue of definition of translation. Eugene Nida says, definitions of proper translating are almost as numerous and varied as the persons who have undertaken to discuss the subject. This diversity is in a sense quite understandable, for there are vast differences in the materials translated, in the purposes of the publication, and in the needs of prospective audience. There are quite good number of anthologies which trace the history of growth and development of Western translation theories, and also traces the history of translation practices. Few among those collections are worth to know for the beginners for further study. One is T.R. Steiner's Anthology of English Translation Theory, readings from 1650 to 1800, which was published in 1975. The another one is Andrew Chesterman's Readings in Translation Theory, published in 1989. Rainer Schultz and John Begonitz brought out Theories of Translation, an anthology of essays from Dryden to Derrida, which was published in 1992. André Lefever's brought out an anthology of Western Translation Theory in 1992. Douglas Robinson published his book from Routledge, which is called Western Translation Theory from Herodotus to Nietzsche. Now, let us discuss few definitions of translations. Now, let us begin with Herodotus' idea of translation. Herodotus never theorized translation in the sense we understand the concept. He also never addressed any methodology of such kind. The beginning of the translation theory in the West is traced from Cicero, who came almost 400 years after Herodotus. But one of Herodotus' central concerns is with cross-cultural communication, how people speaking different languages manage to pass ideas on to each other, and he places that process in an insistently geopolitical context. Among the ancient Western translators, there is Aristeas, who come after Herodotus. A book called Letter of Aristeas informed us about Alexandrian translation, which was practiced as sacred work, and they used to wash their hands ritually every day before start with translating. Rhetoricians and famous orator Cicero comes in 106 BCE, who is often considered as the founder of Western translation theory. He is the first scholar who talks about method of translation and also offers how to achieve the best translation. His remarks on the pedagogical use of translation from Greek to Latin in the training of an orator were expanded by Horace, Pliny the Younger, Quintilian, and Aulus Gellius in Rome, adapted for medieval Christian theology by Jerome, and cited repeatedly by Catholics and Reformers and Humanists in support of their translatorial and pedagogical principles from the 14th to the 17th centuries. Dryden, another very famous translation theorist of West, Dryden proposes three types of translation which can be useful to understand all kinds of translation. He says, first, about metaphrase, or turning an author word by word, from line by line, from one language into another. Ben Jonson's translation of Horace's Ars Poetica, or Art of Poetry, falls into this category. The second proposal of Dryden was that paraphrase, or translation with latitude, where the author is kept in view by the translator so as never can be lost, but his words are not strictly followed in his own sense, and that too is admitted to be amplified. Waller's translation of Virgin's fourth Aeneid falls into this category. The third way is that of imitation, where the translator, if now he is not lost that name, because such kind of translation takes a huge freedom. So the translator assumes the liberty not only to vary from the words and sense, but to forsake them both as he sees occasion and taking only some general hints from the original, to run division on the groundwork as he pleases. Such is Mr. Cole's practice in turning two odes of Pindar and one of Horace into English. Goethe, as we all know, an eminent author, scholar and philosopher of Germany, talks about translation and world literature in his different notes on literature and other writings. In his concept of third epoch of translation, in which translation is not received instead of the other text or the original, but rather in the other's stead, Goethe said later, when translating, one should go as far as the untranslatable. Only then does one become aware of the foreign nation and the foreign language. Roman Jakobson, a renowned formalist, divides translation in three ways. One is intralingual translation, when translation took place in the same language. The second is interlingual translation, when translation happens between two languages. And the third one is intersemiotic translation, when translation took place from one science system to another science system. Eugene Nida, a famous linguist and one of the most significant figure of modern translation theory of the West, defined translation as, I quote, translation consists in reproducing in the receptor language the closest natural equivalent of the source language message, first in terms of meaning and secondly in terms of style. His most profound idea was on equivalence, which is paid great attention by the later theorists also. Equivalence is considered as most crucial and complex strategy to adapt while translating a text of distant culture. He talks about two kinds of equivalences. One is the formal equivalence and the other is dynamic equivalence. If we trace the history of growth and development of Western translation theories, we can observe that language is paid central attraction of translation theory until 1980s in the West. It is not only addressed by the linguistic turn of translation, but historically Western theorists took language very sincerely to understand the method of translation, and they theorize how language works while translating a text. And thus semiotics also becomes very significant to understand the role of language, especially when formalists like Roman Jakobson gives his three-tier definition of translation. Susan Bassnett, in her book Translation Studies, begins with the central issues concerning the discipline of translation studies as the first chapter of the book, and she focuses on language and semiotics at first. She begins discussion with a quotation from Hawke's 1977 book Structuralism and Semiotics. I quote, "The first step towards an examination of the process of translation must be to accept that although translation has a central core of linguistic activity, it belongs most properly to semiotics, the science that studies sign system or structures, sign processes and sign functions." I unquote. Later in the 20th century, we observe a theoretical and methodological flow of intellectual inputs in the sphere of translation. Walter Benjamin's Task of the Translator, Ezra Pound's Guido's Relation, Borges's The Translators of the Thousands and One Nights, Nabokov's Problem of Translation, Vinay and Darvelnet's A Methodology of Translation, Jakobson's On Linguistic Aspects of Translation, Nida's Principles of Correspondence, Catford's Translation Shifts, Levy's Translation as a Decision Process, Holmes' The Name and Nature of Translation Studies, George Trainor's Miller's The Hermeneutic Motion, and Lawrence Venuti's Translation Community Utopia are few among seminal texts which reconceptualize translation in different cultural, historical, literary, linguistic, and economic context. Now, let us discuss about Indian perspective on translation. As I told earlier, the translation in India has received in quite broader way, while in West, early theorists were quite serious about the issue of faithfulness. In India, translation was received in broader spectrum with its all possible varieties. But unlike Europe, Indian translation is theorized, or any anthology has been published tracing the growth and development and nature of Indian translation. When translation scholars or theorists talk about Indian concept of translation, they took references of different texts and notes of the translators to understand the nature of Indian translation. If we trace the history of idea of translation in pre-colonial India, we can find translation was popularly practiced as retelling in different Indian languages, mainly the text like the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Purana, and many more Sanskrit texts are used to be translated into different Indian languages. And the stories of those source texts are retold, recreated again in the specific Indian language to make it more acceptable to the target audience. Such pre-colonial translation has immense importance in the formation of bhasha or modern Indian languages. Through these translations, loka, desha, and bhasha were imagined. So translation involved not only the local language, but it helps people to imagine their desh through telling of their local stories or making the characters of deshi from Sanskrit, which is known as Devo Bhasha. According to K. Sachidanandan, original has never been specially privileged and the translator's position has never been secondary in India. Such kind of retelling of classics or epics is also known as a recreation or creative departure, which was very common practice or prevalent norm in translating. Pre-colonial translation in India was also very much intertextual, with reference of Sujit Mukherjee's analysis of Indian translation. Shibani Fukan says, I quote, "While I use transcreation to describe the translation practice of pre-colonial India, Sujit Mukherjee notes in transcreating translation that a variety of terms such as anubad or vivartanam from Sanskrit and tarjuma from Arabic are prevalent in that period." Drawing on Mukherjee, I would like to argue that it is very lack of a single equivalent Indian word for the modern term translation that demonstrates the plurality of practices informing translation activities in pre-colonial India. Indranath Chaudhary mentions that India is a translation area. Chaudhary refers Suniti Kumar Chatterjee and says that the polyglottism ancient Indian was responsible for developing translation consciousness among Indians. Vatsyana's phrase loko pichanuvad, which means translatability, explains the historical length of existence of India's translating consciousness. While piecing together what has been said about translation in different texts, one can realize that in Indian context the term for translation is anuvad, a repetition of what is enjoined by a Vedic text with a different wording. But repetition is not understood as a literal word by word rendering of the original from source to target. In the Indian context, the reader is never a passive receiver of a text in which its truth is enshrined. Chaudhary also mentions that besides the notion of repetition, Vidhi Vihita Sanu Vachanuvadaha, Gopatha Brahmana reflects on the doctrine of purposefulness of translation or Saprajanam Anuvadaha. This is how Chowdhury points out that the problem of translation is not cultural or linguistic problem purely, but aesthetic problem too. And the word prayojanam is to mention the aesthetic necessity of translation. Ancient Indian translation theorists are very much concerned about the aesthetic of translated text. Jaiminian assures that the revelation of meaning is translation, which in Sanskrit calls Jatasya Katha Namanuvadaha. Kayat and Tolkappir talks about Pramanantar, the contextual meaning, which means when transferred translation becomes a reality. Indranath Chaudhuri refers Ayappa Panikkar has pieced together some very useful concepts in the context of medieval Indian translation of Sanskrit classics, which in fact reveal all that is said about translation by the Sanskrit theoreticians, but in a new dimension. These concepts are Anukriti, Arthakriya, Vyakti Vivekam, Ullurai, etc. Anukriti is imitation of the original. One can imitate only what one is not. The product of imitation is not the same text but a similar text. Arthakriya is putting emphasis on the manifold or ways in which meanings are enacted in different texts. It emphasizes the creation of meaning or addition, omission, displacement and expansion. Vyakti Vivekam is rendering of the meaning inferred by the reader or invoking interpretation based on anumana or interference potential of a given passage. Ullurai is a Dravidian term, primarily means the inner space, not the heard melody, but the one unheard or the speech within in a literary text. This is the vital layer. During colonial era, we find translation is being used for very political purpose. One side, it helps to build contacts between the East and the West through the translation of the Orientalist, and the other side, it shows how cultural hierarchy and imperial rules was paced with the hegemony of translation done by the British institution in India. Ganesh Devi says, translation as a political weapon is not always and necessarily employed towards reducing the gap between the divine and the profane, the high and the low. In recent years, translation theories like Shujit Mukherjee, Ganesh Devi, Harish Trivedi, Uday Narayan Singh, Tejaswini Niranjana produced masterpieces on Indian translation of colonial and post-colonial era. Now let us conclude our whole discussion. This discussion on Eastern and Western ideas of translation introduces very brief and basic understanding about translation. But translation studies as a discipline has been enriched very much, and it involves so many unexplored areas of mapping. So every day we are experiencing new definitions, new methodologies, new ideas and new practices of translation. These new explorations are introducing more complex issues involved in the work of translation. The cultural turn and post-colonial approaches in translation studies is not only opening new concepts and ideas of Western translation, but Indian theoretical practices has also been adapted. All these theories to explore variety of Indian translation. Now let me summarize the whole discussion. First, we just introduced the idea of discussing translation in Western and Indian context. Then we talked about the translation studies as a discipline, how translation studies as a discipline has been emerged, and what is the third area of translation studies, how translation studies become more complex, and how translation studies becomes interdisciplinary interdisciplinary discipline. Actually, the interdisciplinary nature of translation studies comes from the interdisciplinary nature of translation itself, because translation involves so many areas of studies. It reflects the history, the culture, the languages, the identity, and so many other issues within it. And then we discussed the Western definitions of translation. We started with Herodotus, and we talked about Artesius, we talked about Dryden, Goethe, Roman Jacobson, Eugene Nida, and we talked about the language issues, which was one of the most concern of the Western translation theorists. And we just mentioned about the 20th century translation theorists and their seminal text to have better understanding of Western translation theory. Though there are lots of issues and concepts related with the Western translation theories, but because of the time and space constant, we couldn't discuss all these things, but we have mentioned their names. And in Indian translation, we can find that Indian translation is quite different. There is a huge cultural differences and philosophical differences between Indian and Western translation, and we discussed different terms of Indian translation, and we talked about different translation theorists, and our lack of formation of translation theory and preparation of the anthology of translation theory also is paid attention in this discussion. Thank you.